Here we are with the next chapter of my set review. This is going to be the spells and permanents for Ordis. Ordis as a theme in the set is focused on permanents but not spells. If you look at which out of faction characters they get. But they're not mainly about permanents. They're like the runner-up to Axiom. So you'll see the permanents tend to be more exciting than the spells, but they do have a few spells. So first here we have the Keylon Burst. Send to reserve target character or permanent, hand cost 4 or less. This complements the Sticky Seal Scrolls, but because this comes from the Axiom faction, you have to spend a rare point to use it at all. This gives you coverage into Sneezer Shroom and Cadgiran Mage Dancer, which are 2 cards that cost less than 4 but can grow very, very large. And they can grow large in a way that you can't just play a 3-cost character and compete with them without removing them. So Ordis has to spend a rare point to remove those if they want to deal with those. You can always play the other lane because it's altered, which is why you don't necessarily run 3 spells that deal with that. But because that is a big threat to the Ordis strategy to just you can make a really big one of those 2 characters and use the anchored effect to reuse it over and over again. This could be something that could beat you as Ordis, so I'm going to give this a B because it's a good way to deal with that. And it also trades okay with smaller characters, although sometimes you're kind of losing the exchange because this is fleeting and the character you defeated is not fleeting. Brass Bug Hub. This is a good way to get extra characters in play. I would say it's a good way, not a great way to do that. It can be irritating that you only get 3 possible tokens the whole game. And it is irritating that you need to pay 1, but it does cost less than 3 or 4 to start this out. To get this out, so that means on the first turn you can still play a character and get this out. I will give this a D. I've usually found that this is just not offering enough total value that I want to use it, but the 6/6/6 for 5 total mana is not so far behind that it's out of the question. Kelonic Generator. You can pay 1 to draw a card on all of your turns. It's very easy to get extra cards in a lot of ways with Altered, especially using the uniques. We've seen a lot of uniques in spoiler season, or it's people opening packs as the spoilers, I guess. We've seen lots of uniques that will just draw numerous cards, like draw a card coming in, draw a card on its way out. You can also use effects like Ozma. You can also use resupply effects. And all of these effects, you know, have stats and you pay 1 or 2 mana more than the stats. While this one, you have to pay an entire 5 mana before you get your very first card. So I'm going to give this a D. The way everyone's currently understanding the game, this is just not good enough because it doesn't have enough stats. But in some kind of world where cards are somehow so important that you would want this. This is the fastest way to draw cards per mana, starting on like this 8th turn, but it's pretty rough. Armored Jammer. You can sabotage, and when it leaves the landmark zone, you get to sabotage again. That's a lot of sabotage in 1 card. The interesting thing about sabotaging twice is that sabotaging your opponent's cards, if things go really well, could leave your opponent with nothing at all to play. And if you stack sabotage effects, you could make that significantly more likely to happen. On the other hand, if you're using Sabotage to specifically remove one or two of your opponent's most critical cards, they might only have one or two cards that feel like key factors, and so it could have diminishing returns. In general, we can probably play Sabotage characters instead of a Sabotage permanent, because we're not really rewarded for using a permanent like the faction that this came from. Although you will see, I think, well, I'm not sure if it's Axiom or Ordis uniques, but there are uniques that care about having permanents. I'll go to this a D. But if the effect of getting 2 sabotages ends up working better than just one for the reason I said, maybe it's worth it. Bountiful Meadow. The next bureaucrat you play this turn costs 1 less. This is, I'll give this an A for now, because I've played with it and it has done really well. 2 is kind of cheap enough that you're getting to wait and see what your opponent is going to do and still develop a board, so you can possibly bring this out and go 1/1. Especially because it doesn't really cost 2, it costs 1 if you can use it immediately. And the extra mana you get from this lets you play multiple cards on a turn more often, which lets you wait and see what your opponent is going to do. It lets you play Isatok a turn earlier, but that's not super important. And it also lets you focus all of your plays on bureaucrats in a way. You start running out of bureaucrats in the set to add to your deck. But if you add a Bountiful Meadow instead, you'll end up being able to play a couple more of your bureaucrats faster instead of having to play a non-bureaucrat that you added to your deck. So it really keeps up the pressure with Waru building these big boards that are really threatening. Nurture. Up to 2 target characters gain 1 boost. I'll give this a D. It's very similar to Charge while getting outclassed by Charge, which I think is a problem for it. And you have to play the front side to get the exciting backside of paying only 1 to get both the boosts. It has an impressive ceiling, but I think too often your opponent's going to just accidentally be at least 2 ahead in one of the lanes they're winning, so that you can't do the really strong thing here. Oh dear, I did it again. Charge. Characters you control gain 1 boost, and the rare version can be played a second time for 1 more. I want to give both of these the same grade because I've found that they're both similarly useful. You're slightly less likely to play it the second time if one board state lets you play it the first time. But sometimes you do play it the second time, and if you do, it's really good. So they're both pretty similar quality, I think. I'll give this an A because I think just all the Ordis decks want to use it. It is a card you might be playing less than 3 copies, and it is a card that you draw sometimes and wish you didn't draw, but it's also a card that can do something that no other card can do, because it can flip both lanes. Unlike Nurture, where you can only add 1 point to each of the lanes, you can add 2 points to each of the lanes, or 2 points to one lane and 1 point to the other lane, and it is very plausible that flips both expeditions, which can be a really powerful way to spend your 2 or 3 mana when you're contesting a big late game board. Both Sigismar and Waru have themes that play into the charge. Teamwork Training. Send a reserve target character with hand cost X or less, where X is the number of characters you control. And the rare card makes you a token for 1 extra mana. So earlier I said that Keyline Burst was the only way to remove a Sneezer Shroom or Kagir Alchemist. That's technically not true because of this card, which was spoiled very late and I'm not super cognizant of. And this one doesn't cost a rare point if you use this version. However, this is kind of tricky enough that I might be looking to play one of the rare point options instead of using this. Because it's requiring you to play your cards in a specific order. That's one thing I don't like. You have to play out a bunch of characters and then use the teamwork training to remove something. It's also potentially not going to be able to remove, like a 4-cost character. We have a character that requires you to have 3 other characters in play. But this could require you to have like 4 other characters in play, plausibly, to be usable. And that can start to be asking a lot. Because if you can only remove your opponent's smallest thing with this, then you haven't really done better than play a 2/2/2 that you could have played instead. And you would have gotten to play the 2/2/2 twice. But if rare points prove super valuable, that Sneezer Shroom use case is where I would expect teamwork training to start coming up. Sticky note seals, I think I've mentioned this as a spoiler so far in the review, but you can send to reserve a permanent or character that costs 4 or more, but you discard permanents. This lets you deal with large characters that you can't beat that cost a lot. It's kind of inflexible because sometimes your opponent can just never play a 4 or 5 cost character in a game of Altered. It's really reasonable to do that. And some of people's pre-designed decks have even fewer 4, 5, 6 costs than the starter decks. I'll give this a B because it's not outstanding, but you usually do play it. It's really important for removing Brass Bug Hive and some of Ordis's own permanents that we'll come to later. Just 6 and 5 cost permanents can have such a huge impact on the game that you'd be willing to play a risky card like this that sometimes can't get played at all to have a way of diffusing that kind of advantage. The rare version is pretty similar. Similar to Charge, I would give like the rare and the common a similar grade because the role of the card makes it so that you're slightly less likely to play the back half, but not drastically less likely to play the back half. And that puts it at about where they're pretty even with each other. Open the gates. Create 2 Ordis 1/1/1 tokens in each of your expeditions. This is not many stats until you start using effects that increase the stats of all the tokens. There were some token generators I was skeptical of in the character review, but this is one that I think fits more because it's doing something you couldn't have done with characters. And what this is doing that you couldn't have done with characters is play a really strong turn that is very resilient to removal. If you play a 5-cost character, like even Achilles might not be as resilient to removal as this. And Achilles won't pressure both lanes as well as this. If you use permanents, or if you get to the 7 mana turn and pair this with Charge, you can create some real threats to take both the expeditions and not just one. I will give this a B because it is difficult to make high cost cards great, and you might pursue other strategies anyway. But this is a really useful card. I really like having a lot of cards in my hand after I play Open the Gates twice because of it being high cost. It's an example of how to get ahead on cards without resorting to the Kelonic generator. So this is a rare version. I usually don't play the rare version. It lets you redistribute where the tokens go. A lot of people seem to disagree with me on whether the rare version is worth it. So for now, I'll say that I haven't figured it out, but I probably will. Usually I feel like I don't expect to play it at all unless I get boosts. And if I do get boosts, then the symmetric version is good enough to fill out a deck slot, threatening enough to make my opponent have to play cool stuff to keep up with me, even if I can't distribute them. Celebration Day. Target expedition can't move forward this day. This is a really weird card. I will give this a D because I think this is going to expand in later sets. But if you can't keep your opponent from advancing by using stats, then you have a problem with your plan to win the game in the base set for Ordis. Like, Ordis is not providing enough alternate ways of winning the game where you couldn't just use stats instead. For instance, if you're losing a lane as Sigismar and you want to add a card to your deck where, like, you know, you're imagining a Bravos player is going to get both lanes on turn 6 or so, you'd probably be better off adding a Kokoba to your deck and getting a lot of stats and just matching however many points that is. And if your boards aren't big enough to do that, well, Celebration Day could stop that 2-0, but you probably don't have a long-term plan for winning the game, I think. We see the pieces of a Celebration Day strategy because there's a permanent that will automatically advance an expedition over and over again. I just think it'll take more sets for that to really come together and be a way to win. So for now, it's going to get a D, but this is definitely one to watch. The rare is both lanes. They have a pretty similar function. You probably always play the rare. We'll say they're both a D. Because it's probably possible to keep both lanes locked down using the common, but you're probably all in on this strategy and spending your rare points on it if you've designed something that has a really wacky turn 9. Monolith Ordis Bastion. This is an exciting Sigismar card. When a character joins your expedition, it gains 1 boost. The rare is very different. It goes down to 4 cost, but then it only gives boosts to non-token characters. I think the common is better because I think both 4 and 5 cost are going to require you to lose both expeditions, which isn't exactly the same as them costing the same, but it's similar enough to them costing the same that I don't want to pay a rare point trying to pursue the discount. This card provides a way to go even on most of your late game turns and double advance on several of your late game turns and make up for the loss you made developing it. So it can be very powerful in Sigismar. Waru doesn't really need it. He's kind of doing some other things. His boards would get pretty huge if he had it, but missing a turn of playing bureaucrats is less appealing for him because he could generate like a permanent advantage because an Ordis attorney drew him some of his key cards instead of doing this. Goreng likely also wants to do this, but I'm less sure exactly how that looks. Oh, we'll say an A for this. Grand Endeavor. target expedition moves forward 1 region. Although I don't think you can go all in with the Celebration Day, I think Grand Endeavor in the base set does have a promising way of like complementing a stat-based strategy that gets some advancements from good stats and some advancements from finishing things out with Grand Endeavor. It can get tough too if you spend a rare point. I'm not sure you want to get the tough 2. It might be too devastating even for your opponent to pay that tax. I will give this a B. Unlike the Monolith, it doesn't stop your opponent from advancing, so it's a little harder to use, but it has an advantage a Monolith doesn't have in that you can be completely outclassed in many parameters of the game and still be advancing and doing what this permanent says it does. So it attacks on different axes in a way that the Monolith can't. Ordis Carrier. This is a pretty famous card because it has a very central role in the starter deck. And the way the starter decks are postured, this card does a lot of work against the other cards. The 1/1 token is sized pretty is a pretty big enough size to be a threat to the amount of stats the other decks are playing in the starter decks because some of them are very small. The rare version costs 5 and puts a token in each of your expeditions. The rare version is interesting, but I'll just say it's a C because it feels pretty risky and excessive. But I do want to test more decks with it. This one I will give a B. It kind of feels like an A in the starter decks, but it has some weaknesses, like it's not as good if drawn later in the game. For instance, the Meadow can be drawn later in the game and you can still kind of play it because it lets you pass and see how a turn will go. The Ordis Carrier might not be as good at that. It may even if it doesn't cost you an advancement, that later in the game the tokens might be too small relative to the higher cost characters that are coming out at that time. It also is in the faction where Ordis has like a really good advance both lanes turn 1 set of characters. So it's very costly to be playing this on the first turn instead of doing that. Oh, one last thing about Ordis Carrier. You create the token in your companion expedition, but the Sigismar ability puts the token in the hero expedition. And something that means is that when your opponent plays their first character, they get to pick which lane they put the character in again. Whereas like if you only have an Ordis Carrier or only have a Sigismar, they kind of have to flip the lane where you put the token, or it feels bad not to. So it's kind of weaker to add Ordis Carrier to a Sigismar deck than it is to add Ordis Carrier to a Goalring deck. It's much more impressive in Goalring, or even Wario's not going to play it because it's not a bureaucrat, but any hero that doesn't already have a token in one expedition, due to the way you like to create asymmetry instead of restore symmetry, it ends up being weaker in Sigismar, I think. Gift of Self. Sacrifice a character. If you do, draw 2 cards. And this is the rare version. The 3 cards version is exclusive to Izmir. This is a D. I think this could be good, but there's a lot of other ways to draw cards. This has a problem where it isn't necessarily that you're overpaying to draw the cards, but the times when you are paying a fair price to draw the cards might not be the times when you want to draw cards. You might want to draw cards at a specific time and then go, oh, I can't draw cards right now because I would have to sacrifice a character that is holding an expedition that is the reason I am winning that expedition. And then later on a different turn, you might be like, wow, I could sacrifice any character and be fine right now, but also my hand already has everything I need in it, so Gift of Self was kind of less powerful. So that kind of inflexibility makes it much less appealing than Ozma. If there were more characters that had something about them that you could just universally always feel okay sacrificing them, maybe if there were more of the eager cadets, is that the name? The Bravos cadets, with a very small body that comes with a token. If you could play more than 3 of those in the deck, this would be a little bit better, because I don't think the rate is that bad. Conjuring Seal. Oh, what did I give Gift of Self? I gave it a D. So we can just keep the D for Conjuring Seal, because this is even worse than Gift of Self. You draw 2 cards for 3 and then for 5. It might be a little better than the permanent that draws cards, but really all of these are just not the best way to draw cards. A lot of popular games right now prefer to put draw effects on cards that don't purely draw cards, and in some ways that's more interesting. And sometimes only give you tough costs on the stuff that purely draws cards. And that might be what Altered is doing. This might just be like a tough cost if you want the pure effect. But I'm not interested in trying this out until late in my journey. Banishing Gate. Banishing Gate is one I want to give an A because it discards any character or permanent. Banishing Gate addresses the problem of these small characters that have grown really big, but it also has the flexibility to remove any kind of permanent, where both the other permanent removal spells in Ordis didn't have flexibility. That means that if you have this in like your mulligan or one of your early draws and you keep it, you don't have to keep like 1 Keylon Burst and 1 Sticky Seal Scroll because you're against an Axiom deck and you're worried about their cheap permanents and you're worried about their expensive permanents, because you're in a matchup where the permanents would be pretty good. You can just keep 1 copy of Banishing Gate, and no matter which one happens, you're ready to deal with it. You also get the sabotage effect when you remove a character, so that helps soften the blow of this costing 4, which 4 is admittedly steep. And it has a very interesting interaction with uniques, where you're using a rare card to deal with the unique. You might deal with everything that the unique is doing, but at least some of the things the unique is doing if it had a cool arrow ability. And you do not have to deal with the second play of the unique either. So it's kind of like, it's a sabotage where you don't even have to wait for the unique to go into the reserve. So Banishing Gate is really effective. I wouldn't even say that Ordis necessarily tends to need this more than the other factions, but this is so flexible that it's still exciting to play. Celestial Blast. Discard up to 2 targets, characters or permanents, and then draw a card. The design of this is interesting because that concept of only being able to hold 1 or 2 cards in your hand to deal with a lot of threats that have a long lasting implications is like doubled here, that you would try to keep one card that could deal with two of those things. Like if you feel like your Ordis deck was so strong that you could beat any number of Axiom characters supported by one Brassbug Hive, but you feel like your Ordis deck isn't so strong that you could beat two Brassbug Hives supporting a bunch of Axiom characters, then this could theoretically be the card that you want to play, and it might not be the most rare point efficient card for that, comparing it to the Sticky Seal, but it is the card slot, most efficient card slot way of doing that. That said, it looks like we're probably just like losing advancements the turn we play this. So we need that context to really exist and be clearly defined and be so pronounced that you can like lose some advancements doing it and then win the game later. So the default score is going to be a D, but it is a very thought-provoking card. I would say it's kind of more thought-provoking in Ordis than its Izmir default faction. Baba's Ispa. You draw a card when you play this 3-cost permanent, and you can sacrifice a character to after you on any card. This is really hard to evaluate without testing it. I'm going to give it a very speculative B. I have this conjecture that after you is kind of worth about 2 points of stats in every biome, but I can't really nail down a really specific argument for that. I have a broad argument for it, but it's not indefensible. So turning a 1/1 into a 2/2 over and over again seems pretty good to me if you can pick the lane you do it in. Or you can even, you know, sacrifice gains in one lane to generate an advantage in the opposite lane. So I think this is a very appealing thing to try in Sigismar. I hope it lives up to my expectations. I could see it being better than the Ordis Monolith, which is more expensive. And we're back to Keylon Burst. Let me double check to make sure I didn't miss any spells due to the page collation. Looks like we got everything. All right, that concludes this video. I haven't picked what faction we'll do next, but let me know in a comment if you'd like to see a specific one. Thank you.